this is how much money we spent, right? Every dollar that comes in fills in that hole. Once that hole is filled in, then 50 cents goes to you, 50 cents goes to us. And the vast majority of our deals these days, but not all of them, but a lot of them are licenses. So we don't own the recordings. We are in charge of distributing them and making the records and exploiting them for whatever financial gain we can figure out, specifically around the master, right? The records, the streaming, this, half of the money from film and TV sync licenses.
Right.
Those sources making up the vast lion's share of revenue that's usually associated with the master, and all of which goes towards the bucket. And the bucket again, this would be, could be anywhere from 7 to 20 years, right? A license.
What's going on? Welcome to the New Music Business. I'm your host, Ari Herstand, author of How to Make It in the New Music Business, the book. Third edition is out now everywhere. Hardcover, ebook, audiobook, however you like to consume books, you can find it there. Today, my guest is Tony Kiewel, the president of Sub Pop Records. Sub Pop is the record label responsible for Nirvana and Soundgarden, but also Beach House and the Postal Service and Flight of the Conchords, Father John Misty, Suki Waterhouse, just to name a few. Now, he came on the show initially to talk about the new organization that he's a co-founder of called ORCA, ORCA, Organization for Recorded Culture and Arts. Now, this organization says it's a think tank comprised of international independent music labels committed to increasing music's economic, social, and cultural value. Now, we get into a bit of what ORCA is doing. Now, they've brought together a bunch of record labels, including Beggars Group, City Slang, Domino, Everlasting, Hopeless Records, Ninja Tune, Partisan, Playground, Secret City, Secretly Group, obviously Sub Pop, of course, and a few others. And this organization has 5 key principles that we talk about during the show. But one of those key principles, and a big one, is the transparency component, bringing fiscal and contractual transparency between record labels and artists. So we spent a long time on that aspect of it. And I asked Tony to essentially open the Sub Pop books and let me know, how the money is spent, how they actually do invest in artists and where all that money goes. And he was very transparent with it, and I appreciate his candor. And he really broke it down. So if you're looking to learn how independent record labels in 2024 function, this is definitely the episode for you. ORCA was founded by these record companies, these indie labels, not only to bring the transparency, but also to kind of help people outside of the music industry to understand how the industry works. They have they call it the Setting the Table paper. That's 155 pages long. We'll link to it in the show notes here. And it is really this document speaks to people outside the industry about how the industry works. And Tony says that this is kind of a research organization, and then they can take this research, these partner labels, these partner indie labels are funding, and they can give this research to advocacy organizations or lobby organizations to maybe help influence laws and help make policy changes. So very fascinating conversation that I had with Tony. We really dig into the weeds of how record labels work, indie labels specifically, but also we touch on majors too, and how Sub Pop invests in their artists, what they're looking for when it comes to A&R and signing new artists, how they're actually developing the artists that they're signing, all of that, how they're working with emerging artists with very few listeners, how they're working with artists on the cusp of superstardom, all of that. So definitely listen to this till the very end. Fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with Tony, and I know you're going to enjoy listening to this one and going to learn a ton. You can dig into more of all things Sub Pop at subpop.com. Explore their artists, get some of their records, all of that. You can find all of us that make the show happen at Ari's Take on Instagram, TikTok, Threads, X, all of that. You can find me at Ari Herstand on Instagram. Visit aristake.com, get on the email list. That's where you're going to get the most relevant, up-to-date information about the new music business. But right now, if you could just pause this episode, click the subscribe, click the follow button, leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or however you're listening to this. If it's on YouTube, hit that thumbs up, subscribe button, all of that stuff. You want us to keep making these and populate your feed. That really helps. All right, let's kick into the show. Tony Kiewel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So there's this new organization that you have founded. I co-founded that a lot of independent labels are part of, and I'm curious to hear more about it. I was going through, I guess we are at this just to kind of set this up, and then I want you to speak to it. We are at an interesting time in the music industry where, as the report last year kind of came out, the global recorded music industry has made around $30 billion. And it sounds like, we're almost at the peak of where we were in terms of revenue-wise in like 1999, where what the global industry was earning. We've surpassed those numbers in dollars, not quite adjusted for inflation. But, it looks like if you just look at the macro numbers from where we're at, we're on the right track. Everything is moving upwards. But then simultaneously, we hear all these stories from artists and indie labels who are struggling to get by. Artists are canceling their tours because it's just not financially stable for them. They're not able to make a living anymore. We hear, people that are getting millions of streams barely able to scrape by and make a living with their music. So what's going on? What's happening in the music industry right now? And tell me, why did you feel there was a need for this organization, ORCA, that you're part of?
Well, I think, ORCA began as a series of conversations between like-minded record label folks like myself, folks at Beggar's Banquet, Domino, it was just a Ninja Tune, Partisan Records. There was a good dozen of us, and
right.
Without listing everybody and being boring, and apologies to everybody I didn't name, but we were mainly, getting together to just sort of discuss the lay of the land and what we were experiencing. And a lot of us get together every year in New York around Indie Week, which is a fantastic event that's sponsored by an organization called A2IM that I'm also very involved with. And the
organization that represents the independent labels, the advocacy organization that represents the indie labels.
Yeah, and they're an actual trade association, right? And they lobby for government policies and represent independent record labels in a I hate to compare it to like the RIAA and the major labels, but in some respects that is the closest parallel organization. But we have a very different. But A2AM is a very different agenda than the RIAA.
You don't sue as many fans as the RIAA sues. I'm just
kidding. I can say with complete confidence, A2IM has never sued anybody, let alone fans. It was a much different agenda, frankly. And a lot of indie labels are started by artists. Merge Records is a really great example of somebody putting out their own record and then wanting to put out their friend's record, and the next thing they're an independent record label. And there's so many examples of that. So it's always been a real blurry line between what we would now kind of coin DIY artists or also the indie artists, right, who are maybe self-releasing or releasing through a label services situation. I think, and I think maybe some of that blurriness and expanding sort of umbrella of types of businesses out there also led some of the conversations that ended up becoming the genesis for ORCA, because those of us who were working at some of these more established indie labels, felt that there were specific things that we were interested in, and specific things that we were interested in that we didn't know enough about. So this wasn't about, advocacy so much as it was like, what I don't understand is, why is touring so expensive right now? Why is it so hard for our artists? And so what kind of research would we need to do in order to wrap our brains better around what's happening there and be in a position to perhaps find better solutions. So, the first research paper that we published was more, internally we referred to it as sort of setting the table, but just sort of making sure that everybody kind of understood the various business models, kind of what the people who were funding the research at ORCA and what we do on the daily, and what all the other parts of the machine are, because we also, I suspect you, like myself and like many other folks as in the business, are reading Reddit threads and comments and Instagram posts, and there's a lot of armchair music industry experts out there.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, especially in the face of all of these new ways to release music, of what exactly we do, right? And while we're
the record
I have
label,
no bones
the
to
indie
pick
label does.
with the indie labels specifically, right? And that there's a whole host of advantages for artists to self-release through TuneCore and CD Baby and the like. And there's a whole host of advantages to working with a major label. And a whole host of disadvantages that I think most people are aware of. But what we were kind of feeling was being lost in those conversations is what we do and the value that we bring. And sort of what our role is in the music space, and clearly, again, not to make too much of Reddit comments, but there were a host of instances where I was like, oh, these people have no idea how much money we put into tour support, right? They have no idea how I don't need to or how the money actually works with streaming. Case in point, and not to go off the rails this early in our conversation, but Ari, I will warn you, I have a real difficult time keeping myself on the rails.
Hit me. I'll bring the train back on track. But go for it. I'm now
going to leave
intrigued.
that to you.
Let's go.
Because
I will. Don't worry. Just keep
never
keep
met
going.
a rabbit hole I did not want to explore. So
we're going to explore many. But hit me.
Yeah. So in the recent, I don't know if you've seen the articles coming out about an AI music generating company. I don't know if it's mean to name them, but that involved in what sounds like really on top of just all of our normal concerns about what it means to live in a world where computers are making art and the philosophical ramifications there. But now what we're seeing, seeing that this broader like scheme to take money, right? That they were harvesting millions. Some of these players were perhaps involved in a scheme that was sucking definitely several $1 million out of Spotify. And I'm reading kids on Reddit who are reading this article about what was going on, and their comments were, "Good, stick it to Spotify." And I was like, oh man, they don't even know that that's not how the money from Spotify works. Right. They don't know that this guy isn't stealing from Spotify. He's stealing from other actual artists. Yeah. And so just like some of these fundamental breakdowns in understanding what it means. And again, so many of, and indie labels are, there's thousands of us, tens of thousands of us probably, right? Yeah. And we make up the bulk of music that's available when you include DIY artists, especially. Like we are a lot of the music that exists in the world. We are helping it. We are putting it into the space, and we are investing in it. And that role of investor, I feel like, is not necessarily understood, or even why it's necessary. And I think people assume it's necessary for Doja Cat, right? Like they can see the money being spent, right? They can see that
Global
there's six figures being spent in a music video. But they maybe don't understand that their favorite indie band, the ones that maybe aren't canceling their tour, but still only have 100 to 200 kids showing up to their show in Tulsa, like that. many of us in the indie label space are subsidizing those tours because we know that it's important for those artists to grow their fan base that way, and that it's important for the overall, music economy that we participate in, right? And that we're invested in, and that we're driving the marketing and we're driving the publicity campaigns and we're providing the expertise and that marketing support and the actual dollars and the dollars to go into the studio. And being DIY may work really well for some people, but some people maybe can't afford to make the music that they want to make, and maybe are too weird for a major label to make sense for them, because a major label has a very specific, floor of what they need to actually earn back. And I don't begrudge them this when you have that big of a staff, and you really do need to sell a certain amount of records to even make sense. It's like putting a baby band in the Coliseum, right? Like, it's just not, some things are not appropriate fits. But anyway.
So, no, that was great, and you touched on a lot of things that we're going to now dig into. So the document that you're initially talking, thank you. I've been taking furious notes. You're welcome.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's all good. It's all good. We got plenty of time. So just for those listening who are not familiar with what you were talking about of that case, I'll just summarize it very quickly. It recently came out that there was somebody who essentially gamed the system to distribute tens of thousands of AI-generated songs to Spotify. And because Spotify, most of the DSPs, streaming services, operate on a pro rata payment model, meaning a percentage, whatever the percentage of streams that you get, that's essentially the percentage of revenue that you're going to get, because Spotify and a lot of the other streaming services pay out about 70%, maybe you guys put in your report 67%, but it fluctuates a little bit. So let's just call it 70% for round numbers. Spotify is going to pay out 70% to rights holders. Now, what you were referencing is like, they're not sticking it to Spotify, because Spotify sends out 70% of the money to labels, publishers, distributors, artists, and they're like, you guys figure it out. Here's the money. Y'all go for it. It's all up to you now to figure it out. So if somebody gets a bigger piece of that pie, and now is getting more money because they got more streams, even if they've distributed tens of thousands of AI-generated noise that they've now also set up bot accounts, which they did through this study, to just play these songs on repeat and all of that, then they get millions of dollars. Those millions of dollars that scammer is getting, that fraudster is getting, it's not coming out of Spotify's pocket. Spotify said, here's your 70%. There you go. Y'all figure it out. It's actually coming out of everyone else in the music industry's pocket, the labels, the distributors, the artists, all of that. So just wanted to kind of clear that up, and it just, explain the pro rata payment model, which that could be a completely different conversation. But
it's like, I don't think it's exactly right. Like, Spotify grabs their 30%, period. And then it's everybody else is fighting over their 70%. Yep. And so if somebody comes in and steals anything, it's coming out of the 70% and just shrinking all of our shares.
Yeah, in which, and there's a big, everyone is working really hard to combat streaming fraud. We had the guys from BeatDap on that. Their entire company, their whole purpose of the company is to combat streaming fraud, and they're engaged by the DSPs and a lot of labels to combat streaming fraud. We've also, there's been extensive conversations about, should we move away from the pro rata payment model to a user-centric payment model, similar to what SoundCloud has been experimenting with, and others, in the sense that the artist gets the money based on the fans, the listeners, that are what the listener spends on their subscription money. That money should go directly to the fan. That's almost like the sales model from back in the day. That's a whole other model. Spotify doesn't seem they really want to move in that direction anytime soon, or Apple Music or Amazon or any of that. Primarily because the study that SoundCloud came out with a few years ago when they tested this said most of the superstar artists would actually make a little bit less, whereas the middle-class indie artists would actually make a little bit more when you look at the macro numbers. So I think the labels, the majors, kind of squash that. But
we've heard different research has floated around in my world where we don't win either in that user-centric model. Because again, on the face of it, it sounded like we would, right? Like, just, when you try to wrap your head around the logic of like how like, oh, we're probably all suffering because 12-year-olds like pop music more, and 12-year-olds consume music differently than 25-year-olds. And I maybe am selling, or the artists that I represent are maybe more appealing to 25 to 35-year-olds, and they maybe listen to their favorite album twice a week. Whereas a 12-year-old pop fan is way more likely to listen to their favorite song 20 times a day, right? And streaming rewards that kind of consumption. So with that kind of in the back of our brains, when we heard you, we're like, oh, this could work out, because if they're just going to take your $10 and split it up equally between the 10 artists you're listening to each week, and if this kid just listens to one artist, and then it seems like maybe we win in that universe. But again, they did some preliminary, work with like Deezer. Deezer switched to that model, and it didn't seem. And to convince people to sign on to it, they did parallel accountings for a lot of people and showed, and it wasn't.
Are you talking about the quote unquote artist centric model that Lucien and UMG got Deezer to sign on to? Because that's not user centric. That's not what I'm talking about.
But even before the artist centric, they were pushing for the user centric, and they were that ended up being the compromise after, which. And I have no real opinion or understanding actually of how that works out, because Deezer, frankly, just isn't a big enough slice of our income to really get super freaked out.
Well, I'm more referring to the SoundCloud media research report that came out a couple of years ago, where they studied, this was like a 2-year study, and they looked at tens of thousands of accounts, I think, or maybe it was like 150,000 plus accounts or something like that. And the conclusion was that the artists with like less than 100,000 monthly listeners would make 56% more revenue, whereas those that had over 100,000 listeners would make less. That's what I'm referring to. But then again,
that makes sense to me. That's what I would have assumed would happen, but we did. Maybe we just fell victim to propaganda. But it's entirely
either way. I'd love to look at. It's hard to A/B that right now, especially with a niche streaming platform like Deezer, which is virtually non-existent in the U.S. But well, moving off of that, because that's a whole other discussion, and we don't see we don't see the DSPs moving in away from the pro rata stream payment model anytime soon. But you touched on transparency, and I read through or skimmed the 155-page setting the table report that you're referencing, and we'll link it for people, and it's helpful, and it's nice to see. It's a broad breakdown, and I love how at the start you said this is not for music industry insiders. This is for everybody outside to kind of understand it. But it kind of broke it down. So you mentioned transparency. Like, most people don't understand how much indie labels are investing in their artists. So you're right. Even artists don't understand that, who are actively working in the industry. But I think a part of that, and why there's a lot of confusion around it, is because it fluctuates so dramatically from major label to indie label, and there is no transparency amongst any of the deals and the contracts. It's not regulated by law in the US, where it's like, oh, labels can get a maximum of 50% of the revenue or something like that. No, we know that the majors historically typically are taking 80-some%, 85%, whatever. It's just like what we hear from the lawyers who are negotiating the deals, or the artists that are sharing their deals, breaking their NDAs, whatever. But it's like, there is no transparency. There is no set, we're going to invest this amount of money. Even in your report, you say, it costs around $1 million. There's a range that you put in there from like 500,000 to 1.8 million or something to break an artist, and that you're only breaking even 10% of the time when you invest, and all of that. So, I'm even the labels that are a part of the ORCA organization, there's a funding discrepancy between of like how much money y'all have, and maybe you're investing the $1 million, Sub Pop is investing the $1 million, but maybe Ninja Tune is investing $10,000, and it's kind of like, well, it's a big part of it. So I want to speak to the transparency and really to the point of, when do you decide to invest in an artist? how much are you actually deciding to invest in that artist? What are the determining factors of that? And how transparent are you at Sub Pop actually willing to be with the general public and the artist community in what you're investing, how much your, what your deal breakdowns look like, and all of that?
Sure. Well, and I feel like I smiled a little bit when you mentioned like maybe Ninja Tune only invests 10,000. I was like, have you been to an Odessa show? Have you seen?
I'm just using it as an example. Fill in the blank.
There's clearly some investment going on over there.
All right.
But I appreciate.
So let's flip it around. Maybe you're the one. Yeah. Sure.
I mean, well, and again, some of it does feel like talking about somebody's take home pay. Like as talking about it's other people. I feel weird about sharing specifics around a band, but there are no NDAs, right? And I wouldn't begrudge any. I don't think, and I would hope every artist we work with is more than welcome to share the terms of their deals. I would say that not every deal is the same. I would also share
why not? Why not?
Because not every artist is the same, and not every artist wants the same things. And so having that flexibility of, I will say, like almost all of our deals these days are net profit splits, and like not.
What does that mean?
Not tricky, clever. Net profit split means that, mostly means 50-50. And in our case, that's what I mean most of the time. It means, and it's different than what was like the classic royalty systems that the majors still largely use, and some indies, frankly. Again, there's like thousands and thousands of us, and some are 2 people operations, some have, like Secretly Canadian has hundreds and hundreds of employees, right? And we are sort of, in the middle, right? So, but and I have some artists who, we work with Suki Waterhouse, who, is like going for it and has a certain amount of revenue kind of flowing through at any given moment that really opens up a lot of options about what makes financial sense at any given point. So like the whole stakes of the game get a little different when there's 500,000 to 1 million streams a day happening for an artist, right? Versus, but I always also for Sub Pop and again, maybe I'll just speak for ourselves for a second here to make me a little more comfortable saying anything.
Of course.
We also have artists that have like 20,000 monthly listeners on Spotify. And it's important to me, and I think to everybody at Sub Pop, that we have a way to work with them. That working with artists of that size is important to us, even if it is a riskier, from a financial standpoint. But it's what we, I don't want to say it's the thing we get the most joy from, because I certainly very much enjoy watching Suki Waterhouse's continued success. But I get just as much joy from working with Lael Neal, who has been recording at home on a 4-track and has a significantly lower monthly listener average, right?
Sure.
But I love both of those records, and I love working with both of them so goddamn much. And but the requirements and what makes sense to invest financially are wildly different between the two. And again, having that flexibility, it gives us the flexibility to work with different kinds of artists, to work with noise artists, to work with
what
do
you mean by transparency then? When because transparency is listed a bunch in this ORCA document. So I guess I'd love to hear what you mean by transparency then. Yeah,
well, I think we start to get into some of it in this study, like some of the numbers that you quoted are like there's some case studies. I thought Beggars was I would really shared a lot of financial information, I thought, in some of their case studies that were quoted in there, and I found super interesting as a peer label. And I think in future research projects, we plan on sharing even more, because we want it in order for us to have a real conversation about what indie artists and what indie labels are contributing to local economies. We need to actually be able to show how much we're spending, right? And
Uh-huh.
while we may be a little bit restricted in like giving specific instances of how much money I gave this band on this day, without kind of, again, like kind of showing their paycheck in a way that's maybe not okay, for us,
Mm-hmm.
but would be okay for them, in my opinion. We're planning to give out some like averaged out, like here's what this core group of people who contributed data did, and here's what the average of what that data looks like. But I can tell you again, like I'm happy to average out our record deals at Sub Pop. Like I said, they're vastly no profit splits. So, which again is different than the point system where there's like things that are recoupable and things that aren't. In a net profit split situation, you have like, this is how much money we spent, right? Every dollar that comes in fills in that hole. Once that hole is filled in, then 50 cents goes to you, 50 cents goes to us. And the vast majority of our deals these days, but not all of them, but a lot of them are licenses. So we don't own the recordings. We are in charge of distributing them and making the records and exploiting them for whatever financial gain we can figure out,
Mm-hmm.
specifically around the master, right? The
Mm-hmm.
records, the streaming, this, half of the money from film and TV sync licenses.
Right.
Those sources making up the vast lion's share of revenue that's usually
Right.
associated with the master, and all of which goes towards the bucket. And
Mm-hmm.
the bucket again, this would be, could be anywhere from 7 to 20 years, right? A license.
Right. So for that set duration of time, and then after that duration of time, because it's a license deal, not an ownership, all rights revert back to the artist, and then they own everything. You guys part ways. The artist maintains ownership, but also, I would imagine during the term, this licensing term, the 50-50 split, the difference between kind of a licensing and an ownership deal is also control. Whereas because the artist owns the masters, even though they've exclusively licensed the rights to you to, like you say, exploit those masters for revenue, they still have more control, maybe, or speak to
No,
what the difference is there.
not really. I mean, not during
Okay.
the term of the license. Because also even in a license situation, and not because it's only because in a license deal we give the artist approval. Like we would never put a song, and legal and even contractually, we can't just put a song in a Coca-Cola commercial without the artist approving that
Their
use,
permission.
right?
Okay.
I can't
Right.
change the art on the record without the artist's approval. I can't,
Right.
there are very specific rules about how, what the artist has approval rights on, regardless of whether it's a license or an ownership deal. So functionally, like when on the day to day, like most of the employees and stuff, I would have no idea whether it was a license or ownership, because functionally our default is maximum artist control and approval over everything that we do. Anyway, we viewed this as a partnership, no matter what the rules are as far as the duration of us representing the master.
Gotcha. So let's talk about artist development, A&R and artist development a little bit. I'm curious, and outside of ORCA, but with Sub Pop, what does artist development look like these days? Because from the outside, from what at least with the major label system, and what has been written about the most and talked about the most, is that the majors are only going to sign artists that have already gotten themselves to a place where they're getting tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of streams on their own. They've already figured it out. They've already built up a fan base, and they've gone viral on TikTok a bunch of times. That seems to be the only types of artists that the majors are willing to even look at. On a personal note, like I've literally sat down with major label A&R who said to me straight up, the artist is incredible. One of the best voices I've ever heard. I love these songs. They're amazing. The show is undeniable. Can't sign them. They don't have numbers, streams. They don't have the streaming numbers that we can even look at, And I'm like, oh, wow. So what do you do? So I'm like curious, when it comes to Sub Pop as an indie label, what are you looking for when it comes to A&R? Are you even able to sign artists that you love if they haven't gotten themselves to a certain level? And if so, why or not? And then what does artist development actually look like these days?
I mean, we're constantly having those conversations, but so it's not a fixed thing. It's not a fixed set of rules. But or attributes. But I will say there's definitely not a floor of streaming activity, or they need this team in place. And I'll be honest, we've wrestled with the wisdom of sticking to our guns in that respect because it's hard, right? It's really hard to develop an audience, from really the ground up. And and a lot of our artists have, either maybe aren't interested in maintaining their social media accounts. They're not only not TikTok stars, they really don't. They don't have a TikTok account. They don't want a TikTok account.
Sure.
And so some of what we end up doing is navigating that comfort level, and also we work with artists who don't. A lot of our artists don't want a strong A&R hand, right? They're not looking for a partner label who's going to come in and tell them, that song's not a hit, go back into the studio, right? And that's not the kind of relationship we want to have. And so, so those end up being the limiting factors for us. And we have several people who contribute to the A&R conversations at Sub Pop, and that we meet each week and we discuss the things that we're into. And we talk about, when somebody is super passionate about one of the things that has, caught their ear of late, they maybe say like, I think this is somebody worth talking to. And then we discuss that and chew on it for a week or two. And then maybe we start talking to that artist, and we're usually pretty slow and deliberate to see whether we're the right fit, right? Because it's not just about whether we think this artist is going to have a gold record. It's not ever really about that. That's so rarely what ends up happening that it'd be crazy for that to be criteria that we are basing this decision on. So what we mostly end up talking about in those conversations is, is this interesting? Do we think that they are doing something different in this genre than we've heard before? Are they doing it better than everyone we've ever heard before? And then maybe we might get excited about like, oh, and they did just play a sold out show, in LA or in Nashville or wherever the hell they're from, right?
Yeah.
So maybe certainly we're not turning a blind eye to, and maybe this one does have 20,000 TikTok followers already. And we're certainly interested and pay attention and want to know all of these things, but that's never what gets our attention in the first place. It's always more about just like the idiosyncratic tastes of the people in our A&R department. And I know for myself, right, that's maybe not to be too self-centered about this, but it's the experience I can speak to the most clearly, and without putting words in anybody else's mouth. I tend to want to bounce around genres because I find that just to be challenging and interesting. And I find that there are things that people do in different genres that end up actually being applicable to other genres. And I find that super fascinating, whether it's like features and how now, what was strictly the domain of hip hop, for all sorts of different reasons. And is clearly super smart to do in the algorithmic streaming world we live in. And now, every pop record is, every single track is a feature to expand that algorithmic bubble. And I think that features game is super smart. And maybe one of the smartest things that an artist can do to grow their audience, right? And potentially doesn't cost a dime. But I could drop 50 grand on Spotify marquee programs and, showcases and discover mode and whatever else. And it won't actually get their song in front of as many people as if they just had Lana Del Rey feature on it. Or, maybe not, let's aim a little bit more like Faye Webster. So,
Sure.
not something so grandiose. But I mean, we've seen it firsthand with Father John Misty, what that does. We've seen it with our like Bully and her features with artists like Soccer Mommy and Blonde Shell and Military Gun.
And do you facilitate that, or is that done primarily with the artists and their friends, or like, are you helping that feature process along?
We try when we can with artists who are interested. We can, like Father John Misty, to be clear, like, he's doing exactly what he wants to do, and at any given time, there is, I love Josh, but he does not want me telling it, hey, what would be cool right now is is a Charlie XCX
Lana Del Rey feature. Right.
No, that's not at all. Yeah, he would never do another feature again, I think, if I tried to suggest something like that. But yeah, but other artists are want help with that. That's what I mean. But like every situation is different. Like there are artists who are ambitious in this way. There are artists who are maybe successful enough that they don't have to be. But also artists of different comfort levels, and particularly the artists that we work with, like Beach House has very specific things that they are okay with and that they aren't okay with. And I think that's part of the reason why we continue, why they choose to continue working with us in the same way that Father John Misty does, in the same way that, Iron and Wine does. And there are these, these artists who we've worked with for years and years and they're not sticking around because we've trapped them in some, 18 record deal, right?
Right.
It's working out for everybody involved. And they know that and also Sub Pop, I think, is a little bit extra, unique amongst our indie label peers in that, like, I've been at Sub Pop 24 years and I'm not even in the top 10 longest term employees, I think, so the people, and that's real comforting to, some of these artists who've been around. It's like, oh no, this is the same publicist is, it's the same radio guy. It's the same A&R guy. It's the same CEO. It's the same owner. It's the same head of marketing. It's the same, these are all, so they're comfortable and they know that we know who they are and what they're comfortable doing.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I mean, that's a testament to the Sub Pop organization that there is so little turnover and that people have been there for so long. And the artists, it's, I think most people in the industry are, and outside the industry, just fans familiar with the Sub Pop reputation. But I want to get back to, I mean, you're talking to artist development, features is one of the things that you do for artist development. What else, are you doing, especially for some of these more emerging artists that, you're investing, because so much of this report talks about the actual investments, the $1 million it takes to break an artist. Where is that money going, especially for some of the ones maybe that aren't interested in TikTok, like you said, or something like that? Speak to that a little bit.
I mean, I'll maybe take it chronologically, right? So, the first expenses that start coming in are often recording related, right? So it might be buying equipment, buying guitars, maybe they're writing, buying a new computer, maybe, or they want to go into the studio. It's paying those bills. That's a lot of my job on the A&R side, is just, a check request for a session guitar player, 2 days at this rate.
Now, just to ask about that real quick, because historically, traditionally, labels would give an artist an advance, a lump sum of money, saying, now use this to cover all of your recording costs, and then whatever else is left over, you get to pocket. Is that how you work as well? Or you're talking about line iteming and approving some of these expenses? So how does that work?
Sort of. It's not, we would have a contractually determined recording fund. Anything that wasn't used for the recording, they could pocket as an advance. Right. And that's better, mostly again with the developing artists, especially where they probably don't have an LLC set up, where they, and any money, any monies that they get from us or a venue or anywhere else for that matter is taxable income. So for most of the artists I work with, it's way better if I'm buying that plane ticket for them or for that mixer to come out to wherever they are or for that studio than to pay them. Because a lot of the artists, especially the younger ones, they don't have a manager. They don't have a business manager for sure. And like I said, they don't have an LLC. So the more I can pay the money directly to people, the better off they are with their taxes. So they don't have to figure out how to like write it all off as business expenses on their personal taxes, which I've seen way too many people get messed up by that. But but also I would also do that. Like if somebody said like, oh, I'd rather just take care of it myself, give me the money. And I might be wary of giving 100% of the fund up front, but I certainly give like 50%. Oh, sure. If you want to just do that. But most people very much prefer to just have the people invoice me and then have me pay them and then and deal with it that way.
So what do advances look like these days when you're signing a new artist? And let's say they're an emerging artist. They're not a superstar artist. They're not a Father John Misty. They're not an artist that's looking to make a lateral leap or something like that. It's an artist that you guys have fallen in love with. It's a smaller one, maybe the 20,000 monthly listener level, something like that. You want to bring him on. I'm just curious, break down that kind of a deal, ballpark numbers of like, this is what it looks like. It's how much is the advance? How much are you investing in the recording versus the marketing, and what is recoupable in that capacity? And yeah, just break down on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. The recording funds vary pretty widely depending on the kind of band it is and how they want to record. And we do very much kind of, we're not trying to package in and make no claim to like big advances as part of our thing. We're trying to make the recording budget actually be what it costs to make the record that this artist says that they want to make, and that we think it makes sense for what we have at least a small chance of recovering. Right. And so that could be I don't think that they've been lower than maybe like 10 to 15 in recent years. When I started 24 years ago, there were deals lower than that, and they were ownership deals. So things have gotten, in my opinion, much better for artists over the year. And then again, that's not driven by largesse so much as like, that's just what the market has determined.
Sure.
And the deals have gotten shorter too. And they're net profit splits now, and they weren't, at least at some point, in most cases. There were a few labels, I think like Touch and Go and Merge, who I think were doing net profit splits even back in the day, but they were doing it. I don't know what Merge's rules are now, but back then it was famously zero recorded, but you come in with the recording done and then we'll pay for the marketing. And then it's a 50-50, and that's kind of part of what they saw as the fairness of that split.
Sure.
That's, again, this is 25-year-old information. I make no claim to know what their deals are like now, but but we were at the opposite end of the spectrum back then of like, kind of, they were very much a contract, very reminiscent of a major label deal, maybe shorter. Maybe it was like 3 records instead of 7. Now our deals are usually like maybe 1 to 3 records, but never more than 3. And the recording
deals, it's just so these are still licensing deals, or
I would say the vast majority are licensing deals.
And so the 1 to 3 records, is it still like, we're going to do this record? I mean, is it like firm option kind of thing where you exclusive can do that? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are some instances where it's just firm, but mostly firm option. Maybe you were going to explain. It is the label's option. Like say, we're $100,000 in the red, and the advance or the recording fund for the next record is, another $100,000, because oftentimes they escalate, right? Let's say, and then it just doesn't make financial sense, and then everybody just walks away. And oftentimes in those situations, it's kind of it's not a bad thing to exercise that option, because then the artist also gets to hopefully start at ground level with their next relationship instead of kind of in the hole from the first, right? So
if you exercise an option, and just to just explain that a little bit, you do one. So if it's a 1 album firm, 2 option albums or something like that, means like you're greenlighting one album, at least one album. You guys have agreed on this one album. It's going to be, $15,000, like you said, recording budget, and maybe some amount of money, marketing or something like that. And then, so you mentioned $100,000. So it sounds like maybe you spend an additional $85,000 or something on marketing or whatever that is. And then the next album comes along. It's time for the next album. You guys decide to exercise that option. That means you want to green light the next album. That's on the label's side. You guys can decide on that. And then that means if they haven't recouped that 100,000 that they're in the hole for the first one, that you wipe that clean and they start with the new 100,000, or if you put another 100,000 in, now they're $200,000 in the hole.
No, and I'd say this is true at any record label that there is such a thing as not crossing records, right? That's what it would be referred to as if you didn't have it be one account. But that's super tricky to do from an accounting standpoint, especially as we've seen people drifting away from album like budgets or album cycles and into like digital singles, and maybe this like what was a B-side from the first record ends up doing well when you release it as a digital single 6 months later, and then it ends up being you know what, let's slap it on that next record. Like,
so which one is it recouping?
It gets really messy. So whenever possible, just for that reason alone, so you don't have to figure that stuff out, you're like, let's one account, everything goes into the same bucket. But again, when you re-sign somebody, that's a big conversation, is like, hey, are we going to, and for very logical reasons, like separating revenue streams, particularly when you're in a position to insist upon it in a new deal, is a very smart move for an artist, right? You should, because you don't want one record leveraged against another if you can avoid it, right? I think for labels, when they're constructing an offer for a band and they're saying like this one for LP1 and this much for LP2, in their minds, they're building a narrative where it's all one long story. It's not like we're investing, and we may invest twice as much in LP1 if we then would make sense on the back of just what's happening with LP1 if we think it's part of this longer story where some of this, you know what I mean? It's all, the math equation changes for the participants. And hopefully the artists, and I feel like we have really open conversations about like, here's our logic, here's what we're thinking, here's how this deal is constructed and why we want to put it this way. But then, and it just changes the way that everybody behaves a little bit, right? And I think this is true for major label deals and DIY artists as well. Like, because a lot of DIY artists end up in situations where there are maybe marketing companies that they're cutting in on like revenue share, right? As part of there's maybe not a ton. That's a pretty advanced situation to get into as a DIY artist, I think. But it is a thing, right? That happens. That does happen.
So you are working on albums still, even though like you referenced, we are in a singles economy or in the streaming economy. Most people aren't like listening to albums straight down anymore, buying physical product or all of that. But so most of your deals are structured on LP, like album 1, album 2, album 3. You don't do like singles or time periods or number of songs or anything like that.
Well, there's two. Yeah, mostly most of the. I'd say the vast majority of deals are like one and one option, right?
One album firm, one album option.
Yeah, one firm, one option, and then you and it built into that is anything that happens in between those albums is captured, as part of the deal. And then maybe a couple of months after, mainly thinking like, if they want to do live sessions of the songs from the record, or maybe there are B-sides you want to release, et cetera, right? So that's a pretty normal way that these deals are structured. But a more recent development that I've seen artists start to ask for is, okay, hey, maybe instead of it just being LP1 plus an option for LP2, maybe it's LP1 plus 10 singles, or LP2 that's 10 songs, right? Like that. If I turn in 10 digital singles in the space between, that constitutes LP2, and then maybe you have the right to bundle them together as an album and sell an LP if that's super important to you. But there's like there's some new sort of things that are acknowledging the fact that like, hey, maybe these these singles have value, right? And it's not just that something that should be captured or not have specific advances associated with, and they should count towards delivering something. And I think that's totally fair. The flip side of that, I'd say, from playing labels advocate, I guess, is that that's an unfortunate turn of phrase. Let's pretend they didn't say that, but would be that, like, well, digital singles are even though they are clearly like, this is where the market is going, right? It's really hard to wrap your head around from a financial perspective, right? Because when that, like, what are you getting? You need 1 million streams to get $3,000, right? Roughly. So
roughly
that from an economic, 1 million streams is a pretty successful digital single for most bands, and $3,000 is not much. From like, I spend more just recording songs most of the time. So knowing that, like, that there's no money for additional, radio promoters or like, God forbid, you want to maybe have a new photo to go with this digital single, or maybe you actually want to license an interesting piece of art for the digital cover art, or or make a video, or even just a visualizer, or animate that digital cover so you have a canvas, or all of these things that cost money and you need to invest in. It gets a lot more difficult to have the conversations and sort of wrap your head around, what does this single mean? What is its revenue potential? How does it fit into a longer term sort of understanding of this artist development and the overall financial picture that you are all trying to paint together? So it's fascinating, because it is, or maybe not. To me, it's fascinating because it's, we do have a sort of intuitive understanding of the risk proposition associated with album releases. And that, like, I'm very comfortable kind of, shooting from the hip about, like, how many videos we should probably make, how much we should probably spend on each of those videos, for a band that has X number of monthly listeners and X number of sales on their previous record. Like, all of that feels really, and certainly when that's where, again, the difference between working with somebody like Suki or Father John Misty feels different, because it's a lot more straightforward. They may make, $10,000 a day in streaming revenue off of one or two singles. And so that opens up a whole lot of, like, opportunities to roll the dice and, like, oh yeah, we can. And and to kind of get back to your original, like, what are we investing in, right? I've named a lot of things that we regularly invest in, all of those animations, etc. But also we have, we have a 50-person staff, and we have, and those are people. And I think a lot of times too, certainly when we talk about labels, it's sort of this, like, oh, this is just, like, I've literally heard them, maybe even us. I like to think they're talking about major labels, even though I've worked at major labels in my life, and there are a lot of very genuine and motivated people working in a machine with just a different agenda, right? And working with artists who have made a value proposition of their own in choosing to work with a label like that. And they invest a ton of money, right? A ton of money. And certainly we are open to investing tons of money too in some situations, but also just these are genuine, they're people, they're employees. These are people who love music. These are people with relationships that they bring to bear. And that's just overhead for us. That's not something that goes towards that net profit split bucket. We have we have 2 radio people on staff. We have 2 publicists on staff, and we have a team in the UK, and we have 2 people just pitching for film and TV things, and we have a whole sales staff talking to Spotify, but also talking to Rough Trade and Amoeba,
that number,
blah, blah, blah.
Right, the number that you guys put in your ORCA report of how much it costs to break an artist, which was, like, I believe, like $500,000 to $1.8 million. Is that is this what you're talking about, of, like, all of these people that work at the label, their time, their salaries, plus the $100,000 that you're investing in marketing, plus the $10,000-15,000 you're investing in recording? Is that it? Or are you saying that it's $1 million for this one artist account that is theoretically recoupable, and that's why you only 10% are successful?
You know what? I'll be honest. I need to look to see if they were including overhead. I don't believe that they were in that, but I'd want to double check because I didn't furnish overhead data to the conversation, which is where I'm coming from. So, which leads me to that's a future project. But so I believe that they're talking about project by project expenses, but again, I don't.
Well, let's just talk about yours then with Sub Pop. So give me a ballpark of kind of what you're spending, not including the overhead. What are you spending in terms of just hard costs for an average? I know the average is not the right word, but like an emerging artist, a new signing emerging artist on their first album. You mentioned 10 to 15,000 for recording costs or so, give or take, whatever. But then what else? You mentioned a bunch of other things, but give me kind of a ballpark of like how much money you're actually investing in that artist.
Sure. And I'd say that 10 to 15 is the floor, actually. I mean, it would be anywhere. I mean, for a very small band, let's say less than 50,000 monthly followers ish, maybe no album sales history. It could be anywhere from 10 to 30, right? For a recording fund. The marketing budget is all over the place, right? And I would say probably, again, not counting overhead, not counting our staff that's doing stuff, and doesn't get applied to the account anyway. That stuff that ranges pretty widely, again, depending on the vision. Like if somebody comes in and says like, hey, it just so happens I'm buddies with Spike Jonze and, he's willing to make a video, but he really just doesn't even know how to pick up a camera for less than $100,000 these days. We would go, well, okay. And the same thing on a recording side. Like if someone's like, oh my God, Daniel Lanois said he would, produce our record. And we were like, okay, well, let's figure it out. Right. But I would say on average, I would anywhere I almost want to look at some recording budgets right now, but it ranges pretty wildly depending on the genre. What's the requirement? Like if we were are we taking this to alternative radio? Are we taking it to AAA? Is this band from Australia? Because then I might automatically need to spend $40,000 to $60,000 on tour support, right? Like just for the band to tour outside of Australia, right? That's that. Okay. I don't consider that a marketing cost, but it would be like that's a normal, or any artist from Europe. Like I'm automatically going to assume I need to spend an extra $20,000 to $40,000. And just to clarify,
tour support, to clarify, you will give an artist tour support, which means $40,000 to $60,000, however much money, maybe to cover the expenses to go on tour, the van, the hotels, the front of house engineer, the tour manager, whatever, all of these expenses. But you're not actually taking a cut of tour revenue, correct? You're only getting a cut of the recorded sales and stream revenue?
Yeah, that's correct.
So why do you give tour support then?
Because it's important to the bands. And for them to grow their audience, and it's we believe that it will lead to more success with the revenue streams we are attached to. I will say, like some labels do attach to the live revenue stream. It's just
those are like the 360 deals where they take a bit of all the revenue streams from touring and merch and brand deals and licensing and sync and all of that stuff.
Yeah. And some just maybe recorded music and live, or some just publishing and live. And so there's all sorts of different, again, we've never done that. And we don't, we'll look at the budgets together, right? So, it's not that I'll just, you're going to tour, here's $40,000. We'll look at the budgets and usually the maximum we're willing to contribute is the loss, right? Like if they are going to to make this work at all, they're going to lose money. Like we'll step in and make it at least a break-even proposition.
Got it. Okay, so tour support, recording costs. What else is there? And give me a little ballpark here of what we're talking about when it comes to, there's of course marketing. You mentioned videos. That But like all of that, what are we talking about on
Yeah.
average? Or,
And again, I'm not trying to be cagey, but it's like a rolling sort of thing. It could be as low as on the marketing side of like pure expenses. It's hard to imagine it being less than say like 70 grand, 50 to 70 grand. And that's just marketing. And then it easily gets into, hundreds of thousands of dollars as things become more and more successful. Right. So you don't start, I'm trying to think of a recent, like when we started working with Orville Peck, right? Who, his first record, and again, not to get too specific with his financials, but like he had zero history, right? At the time we started working with them. So we were really coming in blind as to what the actual sales potential is. But he had some really interesting video ideas. He obviously had a vision for himself and how he was going to present this whole project that was important to the project. So we definitely stepped up for way more expensive videos than we might have otherwise. And thankfully that all panned out. Right. And that wasn't clear until well after the record. It wasn't like the singles took off. Right. It wasn't until the album had been out and he had been touring a little bit with tour support and with, and us rolling the dice on some of these videos, but also him, and not to discount the level of belief that guy just has in himself and had from the very beginning, right?
Yeah.
And it was contagious, right? How that belief. But it's also true, artists like Wiseblood, who did have a pretty solid, a long history. She had been working things, she'd been making great records for a long time by the time we started working with her. Things definitely quantum leaped on our first project together. So we went in with one expectation, and then by the time we were done, just keeping up with it, you end up spending perhaps several $100,000 extra dollars. Right?
Who are you just referencing?
Wiseblood.
Okay, cool. So that that makes sense.
Or Suki Waterhouse, for that matter, who's another one who had no sales history when we started. Right? Yeah.
Was she was Sub Pop her first label, or was she with somebody before you guys?
No, she'd been writing and recording for several years, and she'd released about like one digital single a year for about 7 years, I think. She had a handful of digital singles up, but pretty modest streaming figures when we started working with her. And she didn't have a TikTok account yet. She had a pretty big Instagram following. I don't want to. She had an audience, but we really,
she was a TV star. Well, I guess I don't know if the Daisy Jones thing came before or after.
Daisy Jones was pretty far after. Was a year after the album, but that was a weird situation too, where we started working on this album, and then one of her self-released songs from 7 years earlier became a TikTok meme.
Which you are participating in that revenue, right?
We weren't at first, but then we quickly partnered up to like take that and like make a new album with that, and then all of her previous material, and we put that out as quickly as we could in an album called Milk Teeth. And but that was amazing because we were like a week after her album campaign had actually been released, and oh no, we already had pretty ramped up ambitions for her and that album, and things felt okay. They certainly felt like, oh, we're off to a really good start. Like this, we made sell 10,000 copies of this record, right? Genuinely is where we kind of felt like maybe we were, and we were going to have a nice foundation, and then we'll take a bigger swing on the next record. But then all of a sudden, then we quickly pivoted, and oh no, she's got a song that's getting 500,000 streams a day on the back of this TikTok activity. So we quickly pivoted, and then all of a sudden we're now talking to independent radio promoters about like, okay, how do should we be taking this to pop radio? Because this is a top 5, TikTok viral track around the world. It's a top 5 viral track on Spotify. And the numbers and the revenue is there. Like, what do we do next? And so we really reconfigured all of our thinking and kind of pivoted with her. She's an amazing partner to just like, okay, what makes sense to do here? Cool. We should really kind of maybe see what we can do for Good Looking, which was the track in question. And that's been fascinating and amazing, and pouring money into TikTok. I've been fascinated with your Neoni interview recently, not super long ago, because it was very reminiscent of a lot of our experiences, and just like, very
with influencer TikTok marketing campaigns and outside that kind of stuff.
I think they had more success with influencer campaigns than I think we've experienced. But
hit or miss.
I mean, it always feels like I sometimes worry. I was like, are we just doing this to make ourselves feel like we did something? Like we have some, like we can get some credit for this happening? Because I don't know that I can actually, I'm not seeing a definitive link here. But to hear them, I was like, aha. But then I also realized like, we mail records to music supervisors and all the time. And, many records never get a single sync, but that doesn't mean it's a bad idea to mail records to music supervisors.
Sure. Right? So speaking of records, because you mentioned sales now a bunch, and I don't know if you're actually using the term sales as in just like the de facto industry speak of like what we have determined a gold record is, which is, 500,000, album equivalent sales, which really means streams, but you're saying sales because you're an old school music industry guy.
It grosses me out. I don't like it.
but I'm curious, when it comes to Sub Pop's revenue streams, what is physical sales actually? If you were to look at a pie chart here, and I don't know if you have this, or maybe give me a ballpark or something like, what is the breakdown percentage of physical sales versus revenue from streams?
It's that's another one. Look, as a whole company,
sure. As a whole
would say it's probably roughly physical is maybe in the 20 to 30% range.
Okay.
But artist to artist, it's huge differences. Huge differences. Some of our rock bands.
Go ahead. Go for it. Yeah.
So rock bands. So a band like Slift, right, does really, really great physical business. And then even artists like Father John Misty, who does crazy. I mean, the percentages are probably in the last year, Father John Misty has really experienced a tremendous amount of growth on streaming.
Yeah.
I don't know, for a variety, starting around the time that he featured on Lana's record, but then he had an old digital single, Real Love Baby, that was always his most popular song by a pretty wide margin. But some point, like January-ish of this year, it became a true like TikTok hit song. And now that song is, now that song does almost as well as his Lana track, his Lana feature. So it's, so on the back of that, like now his streaming numbers are all crazy. But before this last year, I might have said his numbers would have leaned physical too, because his fan base is so deeply connected. Right. And I think that's what we see when a listener is truly a fan, which was something I was really taken by with your conversation with Neoni. I was like, oh, these kids are pretty savvy, right? Like the amount of thought and care that they put into understanding the difference between a listener and a fan, I thought was I was impressed by that. But that's the thing, and one of the indicators is and something we've wrestled as a legacy indie label, especially who's built their business selling physical product, and still, maybe for better or for worse, is still part of our core programming, right? Whether it's albums versus singles, physical versus streaming, like that stuff is our relationships with indie record stores. All of these things are still super important to us. And, but also I've had to reckon with the reality that, people aren't consuming the music on these physical objects necessarily anymore. And even the ones who are, right? Like what is a small percentage of the people who are buying them. And why are people buying them? They're buying them as totems of their fandom. They, and as collectibles, and probably some are buying them because they think they have some sort of like Bitcoin value or something.
No, but this is a really, I mean, you make and the reason I ask about this is because when we look at the global recorded revenue numbers, physical is under 10%. I mean, it's just not really tracking anymore. The fact that you're at 20 to 30% as a label, and like you said, some artists are even much higher than that. I had Terry Cole, who runs Coal Mine Records, which is more of kind of like a soul, funk, R&B label, very very niche, but they do more revenue in physical than they do in digital, which was mind blowing to me. I mean, in this era in 2024. So it does also speak to just kind of how indie labels and indie artists function very differently than major label artists in terms of just kind of that artist fan relationship, and where they're prioritizing that fandom, and how they're monetizing their audience.
When it's one of those, to go back to the list of things that we spend money on, that's also one of the big ones for us, right? Manufacturing vinyl is
sure
just stupid expensive, and the shipping of it is even dumber, right? It's crazy how much money it costs to mail. I mean, people know, they see it when they're ordering the one, right? And they're like, what? It's how much to ship one record? Is like, yeah, and we're mailing pallets of those. And let me tell you, there's not much of a price break when you're shipping a pallet of these.
Really?
Even worse is, oh my God, no, it's crazy how much money we spend shipping pallets of records around the place. And we are also we try to be mindful, both for cost reasons, but also environmental reasons. We run parallel manufacturing here and in Europe so that we don't have to ship stuff overseas.
Oh, that's smart.
And also, we still ship to Australia and New Zealand, but when we can, like a Father John Misty or a Suki maybe does enough business. Certainly this was the case when we worked with Flight of the Conchords. And maybe why we started figuring out how to make stuff down there, but we'll make stuff down there as well, just so we don't have to ship it all the way. That stuff is expensive, and it's and another in the overhead, not part of the bucket of expenses, is we have 4 people in our art department, and that's what they're designing. I mean, now it's crazy. They're designing social banners and canvases and digital ads and all that sort of stuff, but they're also really busy making retail posters and LP jackets and dust sleeves and and stickers that go on the front of the LPs that explain to you all of the great things about the record you are holding in your hand. And
I mean, but it's interesting because all these various departments that Sub Pop has, it, to me at least, it signals where you're earning your 50%. I mean, it's like, that is, it makes perfect sense to me. Like, as someone who's run indie artist careers for many years, like all the jobs that you're talking about and all the various roles, like artists have to fund that if we don't have a partner to do that. And so it's like, I'm happy if I would, to give up a bit of, the percentage or whatever for a partner to kind of fund that, because even though you're not recouping it, it's just like that does feel like a true partnership. And I think most artists at least are coming around and understand that, whereas like where that 50% is going, it's a lot of times it's not just to line the pockets and profit. It's like, it actually is, all of these responsibilities and roles and manpower and time that we would be funding on our own, as artists, without that partnership. And it is nice, it feels like a true partnership.
I mean, we really very much perceive ourselves that way and enter into the relationships with artists in that spirit, and hope that they feel that. I mean, we're pretty careful about only entering into relationships where that's understood. But and I think that's true of most indie labels, certainly the ones involved with ORCA. And part of the reason why we felt like there was that there was this story to tell is like, listen, again, there's all of these different value propositions and business models that are out there, and we're pretty proud of ours, and we're pretty proud of what we invest into the developing artist community, especially, and that we are kind of unique in that way. And like, I don't want to say we're like a keystone species or anything and like make too many ecosystem references, but you know what I mean? Like, it's great that DIY artists exist and have tools available to them. But that's money that isn't getting reinvested necessarily in other artists in their community. And that is exactly, to some extent, we are taking some Postal Service and Nirvana money and investing it in Hannah Jadago, right? Like, that is exactly what we're doing.
Right.
And we feel lucky to be in that position. We're also real proud of it. We're proud of the risks that we're taking and the artists that we work with and that choose to work with us. And I don't know, I think it's a really, so I think there was part of like a desire to step up and kind of start talking about that a little bit more, but also to work together, because honestly, some of us are doing well. Like, we are figuring some stuff out. We are, making enough money to where we can, like, hey, maybe what kind of research do we need in order to show, and this isn't on the docket of things that we're going to do, but it's something we talk about. It's like, what would it take to get the United States, government to have a hard discussion about visa costs? And how do we show the actual value of international touring artists to the U.S. economy as a whole? Right, to restaurants. Do we get
grants to artists from the U.S. government, which doesn't really exist in our country, but does in Canada?
No, and elsewhere. And again, it'd be one thing if we could just get them to not automatic, and it's not even just that, it's like an extra $3,000, right, to any foreign band that wants to come tour the States when they're already for sure going to be losing, unless you're like Royal Otis, right? Like, and you're just immediately a hit out of the gate, or immediately a hit off the back of your Saltburn cover song. That's the kind of, like, that's a rare instance, and the vast majority of developing bands trying to get over to the US, which is again where a lot of culture is still like elevated, right? You talk to artists from Australia, especially, and they'll tell you how much they feel geographically bubbled, right? And how difficult it is for them to escape. And that's a big one for me, is because we work with a lot of artists from around the world, and and UK artists tend to do okay, but it can be really hard for even a French band or a German band, right? Even ones that are singing in English, right? To actually feel like their TikTok posts or even their Spotify uploads. And I don't think TikTok actually will tell you, like, we do geographically target your post based on where you posted it from, because that's who's most likely to be interested in your posting.
Sure.
And Spotify says that they don't do that, right? To be clear, they do geofence, right, is what we would call it. And but at the same time, they still can't help but, like, all the ways that the algorithm, all of the metrics that the algorithm uses to find your audience end up being really biased. And you can see it, right? I can see it, because I'll have I'll have basically a metal band from wherever, I'm going to make it a Belgian metal band, and the 10 fans also will be totally random other Belgian bands and not any metal band. And you're just like, that's not real, right? That's not happening.
So is part of the goal of, or at least the intention of ORCA, to do some lobbying and advocacy work with our elected officials and get laws passed and try to make it a little bit easier for artists to be artists and to tour the U.S. and to, I know this is an international organization. There's a lot of UK references in here too, but is some of that, is there that aspect of this organization too?
I think what we're more inclined to do is try to get the research together and work with people like A2IM or AIM in the UK or Impala in Europe. There are a number of amazing trade associations, and they're way better equipped, and they're potentially working with lobbyists already. And, so that, and it's also where, where we can have conversations like, what would be helpful to you? Like, what kind of information, what do you think is going on, and how can we like do some research to find out if that's really what's happening and what makes the most sense to try to address it. Because again, I think we're just like the ORCA members, which, I think we're mostly just coming from the perspective of, hey, we think this market segment, and the people who work at our companies and the artists that we work with are all really proud of what we do. And we're facing a number of obstacles and hurdles, but also some misunderstandings we'd like to clear up, or broad paint brushes that we'd like to not be tarred with. But mostly we just want to, kind of, I think it's more about just like telling our own story and again, getting research that other organizations might find useful. Rather than advocacy ourselves, I think.
Cool. That makes sense. And who's funding this research right now with ORCA?
The members. So all the member labels involved.
Got it.
We're all just chipping in.
Cool.
And
Cool. Great. Well, Tony, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I appreciate you hanging on with me the whole way through and being so transparent and open. With all of this, I could keep going with you for hours, but we got to call it. And I have one final question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, and that is, what does it mean to you to make it in the new music business?
Well, my dream for every artist that I work with is that they can afford to live off of their art. Just to be able to dedicate the time and attention to their craft and to be free to make what they want to make without feeling any sort of pressure to bend to cultural whims or market forces. I think because I think that's the, especially, to do a callback to AI. I think in the world we live in now, it's more important than ever for human expression to be as honest as possible.
Beautiful. Tony, thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you, Ari. It's been a pleasure.
Today's episode was edited by Ari Davids with music by Grassroots District and produced by all the great people at Ari's Take.